In the aftermath of the Second World War, it felt like the world had lost its soul. The unspeakable horrors of the conflict hadn't just left cities in rubble. They had shattered our faith in common decency. Nations were split, ideologies were at war, and the fragile peace that followed was always one step away from collapsing into a new kind of darkness. The world needed a new code to live by, a universal standard that could somehow bind all of humanity back together. But this monumental task, the job of defining the very soul of the post-war world, wouldn't be led by a general or a king. It would be championed by a woman who had just lost her husband, the President of the United States, and who most people expected to just disappear. They saw a grieving widow, a political relic. They were about to find out how wrong they were. This is the story of how Eleanor Roosevelt, with little more than her convictions and a voice that refused to be silenced, stepped onto the world stage and spearheaded one of the greatest moral achievements of the 20th century. Imagine a world shattered by the most devastating war in history. Millions are dead, nations are in ruins, and the old certainties are gone, consumed by fire and fury. Now, who do you ask to define the future? The job fell to a woman many in power dismissed as a sentimental appointment, a token. A grieving widow who was supposed to be navigating her own loss, not a world stage determined to sideline her. They couldn't have been more mistaken. She was about to challenge superpowers, redefine diplomacy, and give a voice to the voiceless, forging a document that would change the world forever. The year is 1945. The wars in Europe and the Pacific are over, but for Eleanor Roosevelt, a personal war of grief was just beginning. With the death of her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the role of First Lady that had defined her for 12 years was gone. The halls of power were suddenly filled with new faces and new plans. The expectation was that she'd retire gracefully to her home in Hyde Park, write her memoirs, and fade into the quiet life of a distinguished widow. She'd already turned down calls to run for office, wanting after so long to finally speak for herself, to make sure her voice would not be silent. But when President Harry S. Truman called with a shocking proposal, she hesitated. He wanted to make her a delegate to the very first session of the United Nations. Her first reaction was pure self-doubt. How could I be a delegate when I have no background or experience in international meetings? She asked him. She felt completely unqualified for the complex world of diplomacy, a world run by men who spoke in carefully coded language. She wasn't the only one who was skeptical. The old guard of foreign policy was horrified. Powerful men like Senator John Foster Dulles, a key Republican on the delegation, saw her as nothing more than a sentimental tribute to FDR. They were convinced she was a liberal idealist, too emotional and inexperienced for the high-stakes game of statecraft. Their plan was simple: stick her on the unimportant Third Committee, which handled social, humanitarian, and cultural affairs. Let her deal with the soft stuff while the men handled the real work, like atomic weapons and the Security Council. It was a calculated move to keep her out of the way. Eleanor knew exactly what they thought of her. As the only woman in the delegation, she knew any mistake she made would be seen as a failure for all women. But Truman had been persuasive, and she accepted the post. Walking into the lion's den, she did what she had always done. She made herself useful. At the first UN meetings in London, her committee faced a massive crisis: the fate of millions of refugees. Some countries wanted to force them back to the lands they'd fled, often to face persecution or death. Eleanor fought back. Drawing on her visits to the front lines, she argued with passion and unshakable logic for the right of these people to choose their own future. And she won. Her skill and moral clarity turned heads. The men who tried to sideline her started to see not a former First Lady, but a formidable political force. That early victory gave her confidence and earned her the respect she needed for the even bigger task that was coming. Having proven she couldn't be pushed around, Eleanor Roosevelt was about to be thrown into the heart of the post-war world's ideological storm. A new group was formed, the Commission on Human Rights. Its mission was monumental and vague: create an international Bill of Rights. When the Commission first met in January 1947, they needed a leader. In a sign of her newfound respect, Eleanor was elected chairperson by a unanimous vote. She was now in charge of a battleground of ideas. The Commission quickly became the epicenter of the new Cold War, a clash of civilizations fought with words and philosophies. The divide was immediate. On one side, the Western nations championed individual liberties, freedom of speech, of assembly, of religion. On the other side was the Soviet bloc. To them, individual liberty was a bourgeois fantasy. They argued that real rights were economic and social, the right to a job, to an education, to health care. In their view, the state granted you rights, and the state could take them away if they conflicted with its interests. Soviet representatives weren't there to build a universal vision. They were there to block the West and protect their own absolute power. The air in the meeting rooms was thick with suspicion. Every single word was scrutinized, every clause debated with ferocious intensity. Delegates from nations just emerging from colonialism, like China and Lebanon, pushed for language that went beyond Western ideas. The philosophical arguments were dizzying. What is a human being? Are rights from God or from government? Do they belong to the individual or the group? As chairperson, Eleanor had to navigate this minefield. Her job was to find consensus where it seemed impossible. She presided over more than 3,000 hours of debate, patiently steering conversations that often spiraled into ideological shouting matches. The Soviet delegates were a constant challenge, often trying to stall with long, propagandistic speeches. Eleanor developed a simple, brilliant technique. She'd listen politely, her knitting needles clicking softly, and when they finally finished, she would calmly say something like, "Thank you. Now, let's get back to the article at hand." Her patience was legendary, but so was her firmness. She worked grueling, 15-hour days, often exhausting the very men who had once doubted her stamina. She wasn't just a moderator. She was the Commission's driving force, its moral compass, and its most relentless advocate. The challenge wasn't just listing rights, but defining them in a way that all of humanity could understand. This is where Eleanor's practical genius came in. While philosophers and lawyers debated abstract theories, Eleanor insisted the document had to speak to ordinary people. Its language needed to be clear and brief, so a farmer in India or a factory worker in Pittsburgh could know their rights. Years later, she perfectly captured this idea in a 1958 speech. "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?" she asked. "In small places, close to home. The neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." This was the principle that guided the entire drafting process. A critical moment came when debating Article 1. The original draft began, "All men are born free and equal." But that wasn't good enough. Hansa Mehta, a fierce advocate for women's rights from the newly independent India, argued that if the declaration said, "all men," governments would use it as an excuse to deny rights to women. She proposed a revolutionary change. All human beings are born free and equal. Eleanor Roosevelt immediately backed her. She knew this wasn't just about wording. It was a fight for the equal dignity of half the human race. Along with other female delegates, they successfully made their case. Adopting all human beings was a monumental victory that embedded gender equality into the very DNA of modern human rights. But Eleanor's biggest contribution was her insistence on a comprehensive declaration. She refused to accept the Cold War's false choice between freedom of speech and freedom from want. She understood what many of her contemporaries didn't. These rights were two sides of the same coin. Echoing her late husband's "four freedoms," she argued that men in need were not free men. What good is the right to vote if you're starving? How can you exercise free speech if you're homeless or can't get an education? She skillfully built a bridge across the ideological divide. She insisted the Declaration include not just civil and political rights, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights the Soviets championed: the right to work, to social security, to education, to a decent standard of living. This was radical. It defied the rigid thinking of the Cold War and established a holistic view of human dignity. By refusing to pick one set of rights over the other, Eleanor ensured the Declaration would be truly universal, a document that spoke to the hopes of all people in all societies. Creating this document took more than vision. It took incredible diplomatic skill. Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman once called inexperienced, turned out to be a political maestro. Her leadership was a unique blend of grace, grit, and an absolutely astonishing work ethic. She prepared for every meeting like a final exam, mastering the complex legal arguments and quickly earning the respect of the professionals. Her main arena was the drafting committee, a small group of brilliant minds from around the world. There was Charles Malik of Lebanon, a passionate philosopher, René Cassin of France, a legal scholar, and P.C. Chang of China, a playwright who pushed for language that wasn't just Western. Eleanor orchestrated their intense collaboration, making sure every voice was heard while keeping the project from falling apart. Her greatest test, though, was the Cold War. The Soviet representatives were masters of obstruction. Eleanor met their gamesmanship with unshakable calm. She'd let them give their long speeches, and then, with disarming simplicity, bring them right back to the task. "I am sure the representative from the Soviet Union will understand," she might say, "that we must now return to the article at hand." She had a knack for taking the poison out of the room. But the opposition didn't just come from Moscow. She faced resistance from her own side. Many American conservatives, including fellow delegate John Foster Dulles, were deeply suspicious of including economic and social rights. They thought it sounded like socialism and feared it could be used to attack racial segregation in the Jim Crow South. Eleanor walked a political tightrope. She had to champion a progressive vision while reassuring her own government that the Declaration was a standard of achievement, not a legally binding treaty. In one famous move, she appealed directly to Dulles's religious beliefs, arguing that a document about human dignity couldn't ignore basic needs like food and shelter. It was a masterstroke. She convinced the hawkish Republican to support the inclusion of those rights, turning a potential enemy into a key ally. Her method was relentless, personal engagement. She hosted delegates for dinner in her apartment, building friendships that were impossible in formal meetings. She used her newspaper column, My Day, to explain the work to the American public, building popular support. Through thousands of hours of debate, through sheer force of will, she guided a room full of rivals toward a finished draft. She had taken a mess of conflicting voices and orchestrated a hymn to human dignity. By the fall of 1948, the final draft was ready. The ultimate test would be in Paris, at a meeting of the UN General Assembly. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Cold War had frozen over, with the Berlin blockade in full swing. The spirit of cooperation was dead. Privately, Eleanor wasn't sure they had the votes. So she launched one last, tireless campaign of persuasion. On the evening of December 9, 1948, she rose to address the General Assembly. The chamber fell silent. The world's most recognizable woman, wearing a simple string of pearls, stood to present the result of 2 years of relentless work. Her speech wasn't full of soaring rhetoric. It was calm, reasoned, and powerful. "This Universal Declaration of Human Rights," she began, "is the product of the composite views of the many men and governments who have contributed to its formulation. She acknowledged its imperfections. She clarified its purpose. It is not a treaty. It is not and does not purport to be a statement of law or of legal obligation. It is a declaration of basic principles, to serve as a common standard of achievement for all peoples of all nations. She framed the declaration as a direct response to the horrors of Nazism and fascism as an instrument of peace, and then she gave the document its immortal name. This declaration, she proclaimed, may well become the international Magna Carta of all mankind. The vote took place the next day, December 10th. Shortly after midnight, the results were in. 48 nations in favor, 0 against. 8 abstentions. The Soviet bloc, Saudi Arabia, and apartheid South Africa, whose systems stood in direct opposition to everything the declaration represented. It was an astounding victory. Against a backdrop of deepening global crisis, the world had come together to affirm a shared belief in the dignity of every single human being. Eleanor Roosevelt had done more than just chair a committee. She had held the entire project together. She had taken a fragile hope born from the ashes of war and turned it. For Eleanor Roosevelt, the adoption of the Declaration wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. A document, no matter how beautiful, is just ink on paper. Its real value is in how it changes lives in those small places close to home. Her work was far from over. She became the Declaration's global ambassador, traveling the world, pushing governments and citizens to bring its principles to life. But her belief in universal rights didn't start at the UN. It was forged in the fire of America's own struggle with inequality. For decades, she had been one of the most prominent white voices in the fight for African American civil rights. When her own husband, President Roosevelt, refused to support an anti-lynching law, Eleanor took a bold and lonely stand. She joined the board of the NAACP. She famously defied segregation laws in 1938, placing her chair in the aisle between the white and black sections of a conference. And she caused a national uproar when she resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution after they barred the brilliant black singer Marian Anderson from their stage. Her activism gave her moral authority on the world stage. She understood that human rights weren't an abstract theory, but a daily struggle. She saw the fight against segregation in America and the fight for rights at the UN as two fronts in the same war, the war for human dignity. Until her death in 1962, she remained a tireless advocate, a constant voice of conscience, reminding the world that the promise of the Declaration was a job for every single generation. Eleanor Roosevelt's story shows how one person's conviction can shatter expectations and change the world. She gave us a common language for our shared humanity. If her story inspired you, make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next episode. And let us know in the comments. Which of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights do you think is most important for the world today? In a world reeling from its own destruction, Eleanor Roosevelt's voice cut through the noise. The reluctant delegate became a master diplomat. The grieving widow became the first lady of the world. She took on the massive task of guiding a broken world toward an answer to the most fundamental question: what does it mean to be human? Her greatest achievement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is her enduring legacy. It's the bedrock of modern international law and has inspired countless movements for justice across the globe. She proved that hope is smarter than fear, and that trying is always better than giving up. And she reminded us that the work of securing human rights doesn't start in the great halls of power, but in the small places where every individual seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, and equal dignity. Her relentless diplomacy did more than just challenge superpowers. It redefined our future and gave all of humanity a common standard to hold high.